Welcome to another edition of our Trade Compliance Brief, the #1 trade compliance podcast. This week is fully packed as the trade compliance world seems to spin faster every day. We will have a closer look at the May 1st U.S. executive order today. As always, please note this podcast is generated by AI, but curated by human. Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine waking up tomorrow as the CEO of a French logistics company, right?
Right.
Or, maybe you're the chief compliance officer of a Swiss bank, and you just get to the office only to find your organization's access to the U.S. financial system is entirely frozen.
Just completely cut off overnight.
Exactly. So you dig into the incident response and you discover the trigger was like a subcontractor your company hired down in the Caribbean, basically a local trucking firm that occasionally hauled equipment for a Cuban mining operation.
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario.
It is a total nightmare scenario, and that's actually the core focus of our deep dive today. We're dissecting the May 1, 2026 executive order targeting the Cuban economy. Because, while the headline of this policy says Cuba, the blast radius is, it's global.
It's massive. And the structural shift here in how international trade risk is calculated, it really cannot be overstated. For decades, U.S. sanctions against Cuba were primarily managed under the CACR, the Cuban Assets Control Regulations.
Right.
And they relied really heavily on list-based targeting. The mechanism was, it was relatively straightforward for compliance teams.
You just run the names.
Exactly. The Treasury Department identifies a bad actor. They slap that entity on the SDN list, the especially designated nationals list, and boom, U.S. persons just can't do business with them. But this new EO abandons that precision.
It throws it out the window.
Totally. It trades it for broad sector-based sanctions. It authorizes the designation of literally any foreign person operating in the Cuban energy, defense, metals and mining, financial services, or security sectors.
Which is huge. I look at the transition from list-based to sectoral sanctions kind of through a specific analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
The old list-based framework was essentially a sniper rifle,
Right.
The government has a specific target, they identify the target, and they isolate it.
Right, very precise.
Yeah, and a compliance officer just needed to make sure their screening software was updated with the latest names. But these new sectoral sanctions, they're like a wide net trawler.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
The government is just dragging the economic ocean floor and catching everything in its path. And the problem with the trawler net is you aren't just catching the target fish.
Right.
You're catching the dolphins and the sea turtles, too.
Yeah, collateral damage.
Exactly. In this context, the dolphins are like legitimate European or Asian supply chain partners who incidentally touch a targeted sector. But how can companies comply if they don't know where the boundaries of a sector even end?
Well, that analogy perfectly captures the operational hazard. The dolphins get caught because of the inherent ambiguity in that phrase, operating in.
Right. What does that actually mean?
Exactly. OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, they've historically been the arbiter of what constitutes operating in a sector. In previous programs, they'd issued detailed FAQs, guidance outlining the exact parameters.
I'll tell you the rules of the road.
Yeah, like whether providing ancillary services, maybe accounting, or generic software licensing counted as operating in the sector. But for this new Cuba framework, no such detailed guidance exists yet.
Wow.
Yeah, multinationals are just flying completely blind.
Which forces companies into just an impossible position. Think about it. If a Spanish logistics firm provides warehousing for a company that sells, consumer electronics, but also industrial mining drill bits in Havana, is that logistics firm now operating in the metals and mining sector?
That's the million-dollar question. And the legal liability means chief compliance officers have to fundamentally change their due diligence.
Right. You can't just screen a name anymore.
No, not at all. You have to map the entirety of a counterparty's business operations. And, the reason this wide net approach feels so aggressive is that we've actually seen this specific architecture before.
Yes, the testing ground.
Exactly. The U.S. is essentially taking the geopolitical testing ground of the past few years and applying it to a new target. We are looking at the deployment of the Russia Playbook.
Russia Playbook. Yeah, we've talked about that before in other deep dives.
Right. The legal architecture of this new Cuba framework heavily mirrors the Russian harmful foreign activities framework, specifically Executive Order 14024 and its expansion under EO 14114.
Right.
The U.S. engineered those mechanisms to systematically isolate the Russian economy, targeting whole domestic sectors, weaponizing secondary sanctions, and now they've just transplanted it to the Caribbean.
Well, and to understand the real scope of this U.S. strategy, you have to look at the global enforcement actions happening, like, concurrently with this order. The U.S. is not operating in isolated silos here.
No, they're definitely not.
They are testing this architecture against multiple state-linked financial networks worldwide. Just recently, OFAC designated 3 Iranian exchange houses that were crucial for converting Iranian oil revenues into usable currencies, specifically Chinese yuan, to fund Iranian forces.
Right, tracking the shadow banking.
Exactly. And simultaneously, the State Department targeted a network facilitating illicit oil trades. That included a major petroleum terminal operator based in China and several of those independent Chinese refineries, the ones they call teapot refineries.
Yeah, and bringing those concurrent actions into the analysis really reveals the broader strategy here.
Yeah.
The U.S. Treasury and State Departments are demonstrating they are more than willing to aggressively pursue third-party, non-U.S. facilitators.
Anyone, anywhere.
Exactly, especially in major geopolitical hubs. They're targeting Chinese infrastructure supporting Iranian oil, and now they're targeting international infrastructure supporting the Cuban government, which brings us directly to the exposure of European entities.
Oh, yeah.
Because they've historically been deeply embedded in the Cuban economy.
Yeah, and looking objectively at the geopolitical timeline leading up to this executive order, European exposure, specifically Spanish exposure, didn't just happen in a vacuum. The diplomatic friction has been escalating for months.
It really has.
Just to frame it impartially, we recently saw Spain deny the U.S. military the use of its bases in Rota and Moran for Operation Epic Fury, which was a mission directed against Iranian assets.
Right, a major denial.
Yeah, and following that, Spain closed its airspace to operations related to the Iranian conflict. We also saw Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez organize an international progressive coalition in Barcelona that pretty heavily critiqued current U.S. foreign policy.
So the timeline strongly suggests that the diplomatic shielding European companies once enjoyed, it's evaporating.
It's just gone.
Pretty much. For years, European investments in Cuba operated in this sort of gray area. They were protected by diplomatic waivers or just a lack of enforcement appetite from Washington. But now, entities like Melia Hotels International are highly exposed.
Melia Hotels, yeah, they're huge over there.
Yeah.
Based in Palma de Mallorca, right?
Yes. They operate 33 hotels in Cuba. They're the largest foreign hotel operator on the island. And the U.S. has already utilized existing frameworks against them. Like, they issued U.S. entry bans for their executive director, Gabriel Escarrer.
And for those of you who might need a refresher on those mechanisms, the entry bans stem from the Helms-Burton Act, specifically Title IV, but the real financial threat, that lies in Title III of that 1996 law.
Oh, Title III is the big one.
Yeah. Title III allows U.S. nationals to sue foreign companies that, quote-unquote, traffic in property that was confiscated by the Cuban government after the 1959 revolution.
And for decades, every single U.S. president suspended Title III just to avoid infuriating European allies.
Exactly. But with those suspensions lifted and this new executive order amplifying the pressure, Spanish companies are staring down potential private litigation claims of nearly 8 billion euros. Plus the threat of direct sectoral sanctions.
Which forces the critical question, right? How does the U.S. actually enforce a unilateral executive order against a sovereign Spanish hotel chain or French logistics firm?
Yeah, how do they practically do it?
Well, the underlying mechanism of global sanctions enforcement, it doesn't rely on international police or foreign courts. It relies entirely on weaponizing access to the U.S. dollar.
Yes. I've heard this enforcement mechanism referred to by compliance professionals as the death penalty for a bank.
That is exactly what it is.
But logistically, how does the U.S. reach across the Atlantic and shut down a European financial institution?
It all comes down to secondary sanctions aimed at foreign financial institutions, or FFIs. The EO authorizes sanctions on any foreign bank that knowingly facilitates significant transactions for designated parties or sectors.
Okay, so walk us through the mechanics of that death penalty.
So it operates through correspondent banking. You have to remember, global trade is predominantly settled in U.S. dollars. So for a foreign bank in Madrid or Zurich to process a dollar transaction, they must maintain a correspondent account or a payable through account with a U.S. bank in New York.
Right. That account is their bridge.
It is their only bridge to the U.S. financial system. If the Secretary of the Treasury determines that a foreign bank facilitated a significant transaction for a blocked Cuban entity, they can impose what is known as a Cap-TA sanction.
Cap-TA, right.
Yeah, and that prohibits U.S. banks from opening or maintaining those correspondent accounts for the targeted foreign bank.
So essentially, the U.S. Treasury just severs the bridge in New York. They don't need to freeze servers in Madrid. They just tell Wall Street, hey, you can no longer clear dollars for that specific Spanish bank.
That's all it takes.
Yeah.
And without the ability to clear U.S. dollars, a global bank simply cannot function in international corporate finance. It is an operational death sentence. Or, alternatively, the Treasury can impose full blocking sanctions, which just freezes any of the foreign bank's assets that happen to be within U.S. jurisdiction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because this took effect immediately, right? With zero prior warning.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this severe penalty creates a massive chilling effect, which is precisely the regulatory intent.
They want everyone to panic.
They want immediate action. The order was designed to strike instantly. Now, the Treasury did issue general licenses, authorizing a 45-day wind-down period for very specific pre-existing operations. But the overarching liability for new or continuing business in these sectors took effect immediately.
Immediately, to prevent rapid asset transfers.
Exactly. The government explicitly stated this immediate implementation was necessary to prevent asset flight.
And the reality of that 45-day wind-down window is that global banks are incredibly risk-averse.
Oh, they won't mess around with it.
Not at all. They are not going to spend 45 days trying to carefully thread the needle of what constitutes a significant transaction or, like, whether a specific corporate client qualifies for a wind-down license. The cost of a miscalculation is corporate death.
So they aggressively de-risk.
They drop clients, close accounts, halt transactions that have even peripheral indirect ties to Cuba, just to protect that dollar access in New York.
And that aggressive de-risking is going to be incredibly complex to execute, because this executive order fundamentally alters the nature of what banks and corporations must actually screen for.
Right, the new qualitative triggers.
Yes. Beyond cutting off access for entire sectors, the U.S. has introduced new red flags. The order explicitly targets individuals and entities involved in serious human rights abuses in Cuba, as well as those engaged in public corruption.
Yeah, the text specifically mentions the misappropriation of public assets, the expropriation of private assets for personal gain, and bribery related to the government of Cuba. And this, to me, fundamentally changes corporate compliance structures.
It turns them upside down.
Right, because historically, multinational corporations have maintained strict silos. You have the OFAC sanctions team, which uses their automated algorithms to screen counterparties against lists of designated terrorists or rogue states.
Very automated.
Exactly. And it's completely separate from them. You have the anti-bribery and corruption team, the ABC team, often focused on the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that team conducts deep dive due diligence to make sure salespeople aren't bribing foreign officials to win contracts.
Well, under this new executive order, keeping those teams siloed is a recipe for a catastrophic violation.
Wow.
Yeah, corruption in Cuba is no longer just a bribery risk that might result in a regulatory fine. It is now a direct trigger for a U.S. sanctions designation that could sever your bank accounts.
The ultimate penalty.
Exactly. The compliance architectures must be merged. Risk rating models have to integrate anti-bribery intelligence directly with sanctions screening logic.
So they have to talk to each other now.
Immediately.
Yeah.
If your FCPA team identifies a potential corruption red flag with a Cuban intermediary, that intelligence must immediately trigger a sanctions hold on all transactions.
But how do you structurally merge those processes when dealing with the clause about family members? Because to me, this is perhaps the most daunting operational hurdle in the entire order.
It is a massive headache.
The text authorizes blocking sanctions against the adult family members of designated persons and anyone owned, controlled by, or acting for the government of Cuba. So, if I'm role-playing as a chief compliance officer right now, how do I actually execute this?
With a lot of difficulty.
Do I need to deploy investigators to Havana to map out the family tree of every mid-level official in the state-owned energy sector, just to make sure their adult son isn't a silent partner in a Mexican logistics firm I'm trying to hire?
Basically, yes. The burden of proof has shifted entirely onto the corporation, demanding enhanced due diligence, or EDD.
Wow.
I mean, mapping out ultimate beneficial ownership in a transparent Western market is difficult enough. Attempting to map the corporate ownership and family affiliations within a heavily opaque, state-controlled economy like Cuba's, It is extraordinarily difficult and immensely expensive.
It's almost impossible.
It requires specialized on-the-ground intelligence and complex investigative resources. And here's the kicker. If you fail to uncover that the local agent you hired in Latin America is the adult daughter of a sanctioned Cuban defense official, the U.S. Treasury will not accept "it was hard to find out" as a valid defense.
Ignorance is not an excuse.
Not at all. Your company is fully exposed to secondary sanctions.
Which means the cost of enhanced due diligence at that scale will force a lot of companies to simply abandon operations that even tangentially touch the region. It is just a staggering level of operational risk.
Absolutely.
We're talking about mapping financial networks, unearthing third-party relationships, merging anti-bribery and sanctions teams, and managing all of this in an environment where OFAC hasn't even defined the boundaries of the designated sectors yet.
It's the perfect storm of compliance risk.
So for the general counsel, supply chain managers, and compliance officers analyzing this right now, what is the actionable framework? We need a concrete compliance checklist for navigating 2026.
Okay, the immediate action items fall into three distinct categories. First, regarding correspondent banking. Every financial institution must immediately audit their transaction monitoring systems.
Right, step one.
You have to identify any indirect exposure to the Cuban government or the newly designated sectors: energy, defense, metals, mining, financial services, and security.
Okay, and step two.
Second, corporations must completely overhaul their KYC, Know Your Customer, and anti-bribery protocols, specifically for any touch points in the Caribbean or Latin America that might interface with Cuban infrastructure.
Got it. And the third item on that checklist involves managing that 45-day wind-down window we talked about.
Yes, crucially important.
If your audit discovers that you are currently engaged in operations that fall under the new sectoral bans, you must determine immediately if your specific transactions qualify for an OFAC general license to wind down.
Exactly. You cannot assume you have 45 days of business as usual.
Right. That window is strictly for terminating pre-existing contracts. Any new business is an immediate, strict liability violation.
And failure to execute that checklist effectively guarantees regulatory enforcement. The sheer risk of secondary sanctions means that willful ignorance or delayed compliance is just no longer defensible.
Which leaves us with a critical, lingering thought regarding the broader geopolitical fallout here. Many geopolitical analysts suggest that the European Union is the weakest link in the global response chain to these unilateral U.S. actions.
That's a fair critique.
If we look back to 2019, when the U.S. activated Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, Brussels was furious. The European Commission promised to establish robust blocking statutes and even discussed hiring specialized legal counsel in the U.S. to defend European business interests against American lawsuits.
But the follow-through just wasn't there.
The follow-through was notoriously weak, leaving individual corporations to completely fend for themselves. So as this new, sweeping executive order threatens European assets, supply chains, and banking relationships with the ultimate financial death penalty, the question remains, will European regulators actually step up to legally shield their businesses this time? Or are global banks and hotel chains completely on their own?
The resolution of that question will really redefine the hierarchy of international trade law for the next decade.
Thanks for making it to the end. We hope this was valuable time spent and to see you on one of our next episodes. Take care, stay compliant, bye.